Alright, so news broke out earlier today that Sony and Marvel have to split their ways between Spider-Man because they can't reach a financial deal where Marvel wanted to have 50-50% of the box office that the Spider-Man films get, and right now they have a current deal where Marvel gets about 5% of the box office and Sony gets the rest because they still technically own it and they're just loaning Spider-Man over to the MCU. As far as we know right now, Spider-Man is out of the MCU and there's a lot going on that have people concerned. Back in 2014, Marvel had a huge presentation where they announced for Phase 3, and we had Spider-Man come into Civil War, where he made his very first appearance in a brief cameo and a post-credit scene, and then he got his own film in 2017, and then after that blew up, everybody was on board with Tom Holland as Spider-Man back in Civil War, and they really enjoyed him in Homecoming, and he's been one of the favorites in the MCU for the past couple of years. He was a big presence in Avengers Infinity War, and he had a momentary moment in Avengers Endgame at the end. And we just barely had Far From Home come out about a month and a half ago, and now we're getting a re-release next week where they're adding 4 more minutes to this film. Now, on the one side, I can understand where Sony is coming from because they do still technically own Spider-Man, and they're just basically loaning Spider-Man to Marvel so that they can incorporate him in the MCU, and they have done a wonderful job between Civil War and Far From Home, and I really love Tom Holland as Spider-Man, and I love the two Spider-Man films that we've gotten. I love Tom Holland in Far From Home, Homecoming, Civil War, Endgame, and Infinity War. And after watching a couple videos and reading a couple of articles, I think there are pros and cons to this film. Let's go ahead and start with the pros first. So what I think about this departure is that if Spider-Man leaves the MCU, there's a greater chance that he can join Eddie Brock in the Venom films and vice versa. And right now, Kevin Feige has a lot on his plate. Disney barely bought Fox, and right now Kevin Feige's planning out. We've got a Thor movie coming and Doctor Strange movie. He got the Disney Plus. We also got Blade that's coming later on in the future, and we also got the X-Men and Fantastic Four, Captain Marvel 2, Black Panther 2, and right now Spider-Man Far From Home broke the record of Sony's biggest box office since Skyfall, and big congratulations to them. They deserve it. I think Spider-Man Far From Home is a fun, enjoyable film. And from what I've been seeing around the internet, is the fact that people are concerned about Spider-Man in Sony's hands. Now, I understand the concerns that's going on. I understand why people are concerned about Spider-Man in Sony's hands after Spider-Man 3. I really enjoy Spider-Man 3. I know a lot of people were really disappointed with that movie, but a lot of people were not thrilled with Spider-Man 2, myself included. I think that is by far the worst Spider-Man film that we've gotten so far. And a lot of people weren't on board with Venom, and a lot of people thought it was a huge disappointment. Understandably so. There are some nitpicks that I have with that film, but overall I enjoyed that film. And we just barely got Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse back in December, which I really love, and I think it's by far the best Spider-Man film since Spider-Man 2. And a lot of people forget that Sony had a reign in Spider-Man 1 and 2 and Spider-Verse and Venom. Now, people are on the fence about the Amazing Spider-Man with Andrew Garfield. I don't think Andrew Garfield was a terrible Spider-Man. A lot of people are concerned about how they're going to be handling Spider-Man moving forward with Tom Holland and John Watts still attached to the projects. Now, I'm not really concerned about what Sony is going to do with Spider-Man because I have confidence in Sony that they're going to be doing a great job with the Spider-Man franchise going forward and out of the MCU. Now, right now they're in the early negotiations, so this negotiation can either come through or it can fall apart. I think they are probably going to work out a deal that will satisfy both parties. But what I want to remind people is that we basically have about good, we have five great Spider-Man films under Sony, which include Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the two and both of the Spider-Man Homecoming films, Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home. Two mediocre Spider-Man films if you want to count Venom in the Spider-Man universe. We got Venom and we've got The Amazing Spider-Man. They are mediocre, but I still enjoyed them to a certain degree. I think the greater odds are in the films that have been there have been better Spider-Man films than there have been terrible films. And even though I really enjoyed Venom and Spider-Man, plus they also got Morbius coming next summer with Jared Leto attached to it. Now, if Morbius sticks the landing, then that gives me a little bit more confidence that Spider-Man in Sony's hands will be good or decent to a certain degree. But if you take Spider-Man out of the MCU, then there are greater chances that you can add him to the Venom universe, which they seem to be expanding. If they move forward with Spider-Man without him in the MCU, then there's a greater chance that we can still have a great Spider-Man film, because the ratio between how many great Spider-Man films there are between how many terrible Spider-Man films there are, the ratio is really, really small if you really compare. Because somewhere in between that window between the great and the terrible, you got two mediocre movies. Hopefully Morbius lands between the greater side. But if you really think about it, Sony has better Spider-Man films than they do with terrible films. Now, I know a lot of people love Spider-Man in the MCU, as do I, but I think that if we give Sony a little bit more confidence, then I can believe they can turn out a great Spider-Man film. However, I know a lot of people are thinking it should be a done deal, that Marvel and Sony could come up with a deal that will satisfy both parties, because they both been very successful. Everybody loves Tom Holland and the MCU, and they love him as Spider-Man, and they've both made a lot of money. So everybody thinks that this is a far more conclusion. But if you really think about it, I can get why Sony would want to depart with Marvel if Marvel wants 50-50 of the profits that come in through the box office, even though they don't own it. If the roles were reversed, where Marvel owned the rights and Sony wanted to use them, and then they decided to up the agreement saying they wanted 50-50, then that would be understandable. But if you really look at all the box office that each Spider-Man film, they all made over $700 million. And even though this is the first Spider-Man film ever to reach $1 billion, aside from Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, that didn't cross it to 700 million. I think it made somewhere between 300 and 400 million, which for a movie that made with a 90 million budget, then that's pretty good. I wish it was higher, because I really enjoyed that film, and I think a lot of people should have gone out and seen it. But if you really look at it, every single movie that Sony has made involving Spider-Man has made over 700 million, including Venom, which almost broke the $1 billion mark. And people were on the assumption thinking that Venom wasn't even going to make $1 billion, that it was going to be a huge flop, and a lot of people wanted Venom to flop so that Spider-Man could stay in the MCU. And to their disappointment, it almost made $1 billion, which nobody saw coming, not even me. So I think Spider-Man in Sony's hands has a 50-50 chance being good and being one of the greats still. I think Sony has learned from their mistakes from The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3 about not so much necessarily adding too much villains, because I think that's what everybody's concern was about, but making a good coherent story. And with what the MCU has done, I think they can do a great job moving forward with Tom Holland and John Watts at the helm. I think that they're going to have they're not gonna have a tough time making Spider-Man films moving forward. Sorry, I had to turn on the fan because it's getting a lot hotter in here, so there will be some noises in this video. Do apologize, but I think there's a great chance that we can get a great Spider-Man film, like I've said already, with Sony. Into my cons, I think that what we've already gotten with Spider-Man in the MCU is going to be tough, especially with the ending of Spider-Man Far From Home, where, spoiler alert, at the end in the post-credit scenes of Spider-Man Far From Home, you see that back reveals the identity of Spider-Man, and we see J. Jonah Jameson, played again by the great and wonderful J.K. Simmons. And then in the last post-credit scene, we see that Maria Hill and Nick Fury were Skrulls the entire time, while Nick Fury was somewhere else protecting the rest of the galaxy. So I think the way that they've already incorporated Spider-Man into the MCU is going to be a challenge getting him out of the MCU and getting people comfortable with him not in the MCU anymore. We'll see how that goes if this deal pulls through, but I think that there are ways that they can get around it, and I do think that this is something that we need to keep our eyes on, because I do think there's a 50% chance that Sony will back out of Spider-Man in the MCU. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the Spider-Man news. I think there's a great chance that Sony will do good, and even when he's not incorporated with the Spider-Man films, I know a lot of people want to put blame on Sony because they've had a couple misfires with the Spider-Man films, but I think what they've done so far with Venom and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, I think I have more confidence in them now than I did before when they had the Amazing Spider-Man 2. So hopefully Sony can pull a miracle. Hopefully this thing can get resolved. If it doesn't, then I'm still going to be there cheering on Spider-Man, even if he's not in the MCU anymore. Spider-Man is one of my favorites, so hopefully everything works out for the better, and hopefully, who knows, maybe maybe Sony can finally get a good Spider-Man film in. So did you like this? Go ahead and leave me down in your comments down below what you think of it. If you like this, go ahead and check out also my movie reviews, and I've got a couple coming up, so go ahead and let me know what you think about it. Until next time, this is Josie at the movies giving you his final thoughts.